Hello, this is Branko Malić of Kali Tribune. This podcast will be on the notion of poetic justice. Before we explain what we mean by that and what are implications, let us begin with a quote that we'll try to interpret. It goes like this. We are often astonished that the most mediocre men have been better judges of the French Revolution than men of first-rate talent, that they have believed in it completely while accomplished politicians have not believed in it at all. This is because this belief is one of the characteristics of the revolution, because the revolution could succeed only by the scope and power of the revolutionary spirit, or, if one may put it another way, by faith in the revolution. Thus, untalented and ignorant men have very ably driven what they call the revolutionary chariot. They have dared everything without fear of counter-revolution. They have always gone ahead without looking back, and everything has succeeded for them, because they were only the instruments of a force that knew more than they did. They made no mistakes in their revolutionary career for the same reason that Vaucanson's flutist never hit a false note. The revolutionary torrent took successively different directions, and it was only by following the course of the moment that the most conspicuous men in the revolution acquired the kind of power and celebrity they were able to achieve. As soon as they wanted to oppose it, or even to stand aside by isolating themselves or by working too much for themselves, they disappeared from the scene. End quote. This quote is from Joseph DeMaistre's Considerations on France, his famous small book on French Revolution. Now, DeMaistre will borrow some ideas from DeMaistre. This podcast will not be on him specifically, but we'll use some of his insights, and I think that this passage from his book is a very good introduction. Namely, poetic justice. Our notion of poetic justice, I would say, is that this is a kind of, let's say, equivalizing, as all justice is, that is, equivalizing, spontaneous equivalizing act that is done not per se by the act of God, as one would say theologically explain it, but is a kind of emanation from the nature of things themselves, that the world, the whole world we are part of, has some kind of order, and when this order has been in some way put to disbalance or inverted or in any way damaged, the poetical justice is a retribution in which punishment absolutely fits the crime. This is what makes it poetic. And there is one more thing that makes it poetic, and for this we'll employ the help of Monsieur de Maistre, God rest his soul. His thesis in the Considerations on France, and in his other books, most notably his late work, so-called Petersburg's Evenings, or Peterburg Prologues of St. Petersburg, that is to say, a book of that is written in a form of philosophical dialogue, which I would warmly recommend. I think it's rarely read in our day and age. It's a very, very interesting book. He was very much focused on the idea of divine justice and divine punishment. Now, poetical justice, as I already said, should not be conflated straightforwardly with divine justice. But what they have in common is this absolute fitting of the punishment and the crime. Now we'll see how this comes about. In the passage we quoted at the beginning, and I will put it in the show notes so you can read it and not to have to recur to what I'm saying while you listen to this. The Maistre notes one thing that I would say is very much true, namely that in great social upheavals that can be defined as revolutions, that is, upheavals that completely destroy the previous traditional social order, the people who more likely than not get the upper hand in the political struggle that inevitably ensues in fighting, in civil war and whatever, are for the most part quite mediocre people. Whereas their opponents, who for instance can be very intelligent, can have enormous resources at their disposal, and who even understand the situation very good, seem to have everything against them and just fail. People who are, on the other hand, led by the torrent of revolution, as long as they follow it, succeed in everything they try to do. And it seems as if the world conspires to aid them. Now, this idea of world conspiring to aid you, this gives us a clue of what poetical justice would be for the Maistre, and I think the Maistre is very much right about this. The French Revolution for the Maistre was unprecedented, catastrophic event, and his opinion about it is that it is obviously an extremely negative upheaval, catastrophe in the full sense of the word. And he asks himself, why, if this is so, if this revolution to bring down the throne and altar, whereas I have to note that for the Maistre, to his credit, the throne is above altar. I mean, in the sense that his focus is, in the end, always on this spiritual dimension and not only on political dimension of Catholic Church. He's sometimes, most of the time framed in let's say popular academic culture. That's the sphere of academia where I would put people like, for instance, Umberto Eco. He's framed as some kind of proto-fascists, that what Isaiah Berlin dubbed him. And I think this is not really doing him justice. I wouldn't mind him being proto-fascist at all, but if he has something good to say, but I don't really think he was, because despite his political theory, his understanding of Catholic faith is essentially spiritual understanding. He's not understanding Catholicism as I think people like Julius Evola understood it, as some kind of offshoot of imperial Rome or whatnot, where the only interest is to have some kind of social order that suits the author. The Maistre was not really like that. Now, the idea is that French Revolution is evil. The perpetrators of this evil, the mass evil, are not brought before any kind of human justice, and utterly noble men, good, pious, and just ruler of France. I'm paraphrasing the Maistre now. I haven't had the pleasure of acquaintance with Louis XVI, but this is what he thinks of him, is being executed. And what the Maistre does here is putting forward one general dilemma most of us have: how the evil goes unpunished, and good seems to go punished. And he doesn't put the question in that way because he is not starting from the question. He is starting from the observation. He observed the course of French Revolution, of which he was, of course, contemporary and partly a witness, although not. And this is where he gets his ideas from. You can tell because it is obvious that it was not a preconceived notion of poetical justice that he had, but more like this something that kind of stared him in the face from the historical happenings, and he interpreted it in a certain manner. If punishment considers the Maistre has to fit the crime, then the crime of revolution cannot be punished by man. That is to say, the crime of completely overturning the social and political expression of what essentially is a spiritual essence and core for the sakes of something that is to the contrary of it, the real punishment must be superhuman or infrahuman punishment. Because the idea is that revolution is a consequence or the effect of things that wrongdoings from the past. Of wrongdoings indeed that have collective implications. So of course the Maistre believes that people can be faulted for some actions, not only individuals, and this is something that is very hard to accept in our day and age, but it has more than a grain of truth in it, but has to be understood correctly, because this is where considerable subtlety in analysis has to be applied, not to go off the rails. But the revolution is not something that one individual man just conceives out of himself and then projects, coerces people into accepting his ideas, kind of employs people to fight his enemies and so on. No, it's something very akin to force of nature. It is what we would call a force of history. And of course, the Maistre is not only one who thought in this way. After him, we have, his younger contemporary Hegel, before him, or even contemporary, I'm not sure, Giambattista Vico, one of the first philosophers of history, then Marxists and so on. And today, you neo-Marxist understanding of revolution as event with a big E is something quite akin what the Maistre sees in it, but with a positive moral prefix, because they want to have revolution, and there is no for them there is no problem in ephemerical things and accidents like millions of dead, because I'm thinking in this moment about some Maoist thinkers, and Maoism had a pretty big body count in a cultural revolution. No, but there are some in Maistre there are some very specific things that I think he got right, because he was based after all on pretty thorough reading of his spiritual and religious tradition, and only secondarily of political theories. Although this reading is quite idiosyncratic for him. Namely, the punishment for revolutionary is the success of revolution. This is what, in the Maistre's view, everything boils down. This power crushes its proponents unmistakably, and leaves the whole process end up being in the hands of people, for instance, they most hated, or people that they would consider to be an inverse of what they in their ideals wanted to accomplish. And this is the punishment, thinks the Maistre. And this kind of horrible punishment, that is to say, one being punished in effect by himself, one seeing his own actions and his own, not only actions, his own essence, what he considers that he is his ideals, because revolutionaries are people who identify with ideas, destroy them. So they are destroyed by their success, which means that their very purpose of being is to be destroyed, is in effect a sentence to utter perdition. It's like standing on the threshold of hell. In the Maistre's view, this is quite logical, and this is in effect poetical justice. Poetical because the very mean of perpetrating the crime accuses and then destroys the criminal, as if the murderer's dagger would denounce him with a human tongue before some kind of court of law. And this is, of course, metaphorically speaking, this is the idea of poetical justice. And here he puts it on the grounds, I would say, of pretty good factual observation, because this is really what happens in these social upheavals. I'm talking partly even from my own experience from watching things in the 90s, when you saw, for instance, in the dissolution of communist system, that nothing, and I said this a few times before, I made this remark, everything that was created by this system, or at least was a part of it formally, maybe content-wise it wasn't, as pop music, for instance, very good pop, or art, even high art, everything came to naught. Nobody could stop the breaking apart of a country and of the system. Nobody. And breaking apart was not led by the brightest, but by, one could argue, the worst, and even in some cases the most stupid elements in the ruling class, that is to say, communist class of that society. It was really, you could see that. And this was, for instance, this was mystery to me, because like Maistre, I didn't have a preconceived concept of this. I just noticed it and couldn't get it out of my mind. But now I would say that the Maistre's explanation is very good. At least it indicates in a good way to thinking about these things. Furthermore, there are a lot of changes in society and attempts at upheaval in society that are not revolutionary in this sense, that are not kind of unconscious, let's say, unconscious eruption of the legacy of the past, because this is what revolution for the Maistre is, as a kind of God's punishment for past trespasses. That is to say, the punishment that occurs by the hand of the punished people, in this case the Frenchman. And it comes for various reasons that people tend to forget, because we don't tend to examine the conditions of our existence, because we take them for granted. It's like in tragedy, when King Oedipus falls into mischief and tragedy at the moment that he reflects back at things that he never reflected back at, his own ancestry, and sees in himself the seed of his own destruction. This is something akin to him, but it is not tragedy, because this is a Christian notion where tragedy is absent, because there is always a redemption, and as the Maistre would call it regeneration, because he thinks that this kind of upheaval, when it makes full course, ends up with a regeneration of what is good. This is where I part ways with him. This is, I wouldn't say that this is so neat, and that this is how things end up. But there is, of course, I share the faith in good, and this is quite different from the tragic understanding of humanity. And of course, there is this moment that of freedom of the will, because the idea that some people ended up revolutionary for the trespasses it did, implies that those trespasses were a result of deliberation. The people are not person, that is to say, ethnic entity or a religious entity is not a person as the individual man is a person, but every individual man is part of them, because there is no such thing as abstract individuum without properties, and some of the properties are qualifiers, are what makes us what we are, and some of them, of course, are belonging to people, belonging to church, belonging to race even, although I don't think this is one of the more important qualifiers, because it is biological, it is less spiritual, it's less meaningful than the previous two. So you cannot extricate yourself from the belonging to history, from belonging to ethnicity and religion and so on and so forth, and you have to bear the consequences of the acts of people that also belong to it and lived before you. And sometimes those acts can be horrible, sometimes those horrible acts can be accepted en masse by the mass of people and end up in what they end up. And the Maistre thought that this is what happened to France, that for various reasons are various, but the essential idea is that this is when mass of people accept something that is wrong and goes with it, and then maybe 2 generations later the same people pay for this. Now not individual is not individually guilty, but he was he is not punished because he is who he is, but he is punished because he is who he belongs to, and this is quite different thing. So that would be more or less how the Maistre sees it. I think that this is one very good explanation. I wouldn't even say explanation, but description. Let's rather say description of what poetic justice is. In our day and age, a lot of things are sold to us as revolutions, but I don't think they are revolutions. For instance, you have this sexual revolution that is now coming into phase of being transsexual revolution, but it seems to me that is all one revolution. The thing is that it's very arguable how spontaneous this is. When I say arguable, I do mean arguable. I don't mean to imply that it is wrong, just that it is something that is far more arguable than communist or French revolution. Because of the effects and of the long process that was needed for sexual revolutionaries to come to the point at which they are now and lead us to that point. And one very good example is promotion, first decriminalization of homosexuality in the countries where it was criminalized at all, and making it acceptable, which really occurred, as I can see, in US from late 90s only towards now. So that's at least 30 years process, and everything in this process was done not by some kind of revolutionizing people, of people taking a cue but in spite of people. It was implemented violently by the violence of marketing, by coercion that is not a coercion of brute force, but rather a coercion of manipulation and pressure, cognitive and intellectual and moral pressure, that brought us to the point where people don't realize that man is the human being has two sexes, and that this first difference in human beings cannot be eradicated, and all this sexual conundrum from homosexuality onwards, that is to say homosexual marriages onwards, is here to make this inexistent. That is to say, to in a way deny man of his essential limitedness and of finitude. That's a different story. We talked about it a lot before and now, and we will talk about in future, maybe with some more references to some concrete strategies that were employed in this in this process. But what I wanted to say in this context is that this is, I would say, something different, and which gives me hope that struggling against it has better grounds than, for instance, struggling against something as a French Revolution, when being French at that time in Paris, for instance. This is the reason, because in the Maistre's views, some of those historical events are too overwhelming, and there is a reason for this, and I would say he's right about that. Of course, this to make this comparison with of this historical revolutionary event and event that is, for all intents and purposes, 30 years long marketing campaign, would take us too far. So let's call it a day for now. Thank you for your attention. This was Branko Malic of Kali Tribune, signing out.